Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a shade more bitter than a lullaby and softer than a confession. We do not deal in myths here, not the kind that come perfumed with lace and carriage lanterns. We deal in what was kept in drawers, what was passed under saucers, what was measured with a spoon that never made a sound. In the back room of the forbidden dispensary, where the shelves are older than some family names and the air remembers every herb it has ever held, there is a narrow cabinet with a warped door. The hinge complains if you open it too quickly, so we do not. Inside are bottles the color of dark honey, each one catching lamplight like a secret that wants to look innocent. And among them always is laudanum. Not a romance, a tool, a quiet crutch, a small permission slip to keep moving through days that should have stopped a person cold. If you had been dropped into a Victorian parlor without warning, still smelling of rain and unfamiliar streets, you might have been offered laudanum before you were offered kindness. Not because they were cruel, because they were trained, by custom, by scarcity of comfort, by the strict etiquette of suffering, to treat pain as something to be managed in silence. A sob was an embarrassment. A shaking hand was a breach of manners, but a measured dose, taken behind a fan or near a curtained window, was allowed. It was private, it was proper, it was quiet. So we begin there, with the hush. Now dim your lights if you can. Let the room settle. Let the modern world wait outside the door. The story we are about to tell does not like sudden noises. Because laudanum did not begin in the Victorian age, the Victorians only perfected the habit of keeping it close. Long before a factory whistle or a soot-stained city skyline, long before a chemist's neat ledger or a branded bottle on a shop counter, there was a man who carried medicine like a challenge. A wandering Swiss physician, half scholar and half storm, Paracelsus. His full name was the kind of thing that filled a line by itself, the kind of name that sounded like it should be spoken only in candlelight. He lived in an era when the old medical world still clung to its worn beliefs. Humors, balances, the polite fiction that illness was a matter of temperament rather than chemistry. He did not have patience for polite fictions. He insisted the body was not just a moral metaphor. It was matter, it was reaction, it was substance. Opium, of course, was not new. Poppy sap had traveled through ports and empires for longer than anyone could neatly count. It appeared in old texts, old hospitals, old arguments. But Paracelsus did something different with it. He made it portable, concentrated, travel-ready. He took that ancient gummy darkness and dissolved it in wine or spirit, then dressed it in aromatics, saffron, myrrh, warm spices that made bitterness feel almost refined. He called it laudanum, a word that carries praise inside it, like a compliment pressed into a label. And people praised it, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. It stilled coughs that tore the throat raw. It quieted cramps that doubled a person over without apology. It lowered fevers by lowering the body's insistence on noticing itself. It calmed the restless senses, the fretful mind, the grief that would not stop pacing. It was therapy and theatre in a small glass bottle. And then, as all useful things do, it began to spread, not as one recipe, never as one pure formula. The past was not neat enough for that. What moved from city to city was the idea. Opium made liquid, made measurable, made easier to keep close. In Florence, in Antwerp, in London's narrow lanes, in Paris shops that smelled of brandy and dried herbs, apothecaries took the concept and rewrote it. Each shop became its own small chemistry. Each counter became a local dialect of medicine. Some used stronger spirits, some used wine. Some were generous with saffron, some pinched it like gold, some steeped myrrh, some added camphor until the bottle carried a faint medicinal bite that could cut through any sweetness. Every town had supply problems, every merchant had a preference, every apothecary had an opinion. And so laudanum became not one medicine, but a family. An umbrella word for dozens of tinctures, all claiming to soothe, all slightly different, each with its own temperament. The bottles were small, cork-stopped, labeled by hand. Some were sealed with wax, not only to prevent tampering, but to make the buyer feel safe. The ink curled in loops. The glass held amber fluid that seemed harmless if you did not know what it could do. In winter, the counter smelled of old brandy and crushed leaves. In summer, it smelled of resin and the faint, sweet edge of poppy. Soft as a lullaby, dangerous as a promise. Knowledge traveled the same way the bottles did. Servants copied recipes into household books. Wives wrote them down beside salves for burns and mixtures for swelling. Midwives carried wrapped vials tucked into aprons where no man's eyes would linger. A recipe might speak in a language half precise and half remembered. A quart of red wine, a measured portion of opium, a little cinnamon, enough saffron to tint the brew like dusk. Standardization was not the priority then. Availability was. Trust was. What mattered was that if a child coughed all night, someone could summon relief. If labor turned jagged and loud, someone could soften the edge. If grief made a household unlivable, someone could lower the volume. And then, in England, a practical man arrived to give laudanum something it would cling to for centuries: professional approval. Thomas Sydenham, often called the English Hippocrates, was not known for mystical theories. He was known for observation, for seeing what worked and setting aside what did not. He did not invent laudanum, but he spoke of opium tinctures with a physician's calm authority, and that mattered. His name attached itself to certain preparations and to a reputation: measured, discreet, effective. A doctor's name on a remedy is not just ink, it is permission. From that point on, laudanum was not merely a traveling alchemical trick, it was respectable. It belonged in physicians' manuals, it appeared on apothecary lists. It moved with an air of legitimacy into more homes, more pockets, more bedside tables. And yet the problem remained what it had always been. The bottle could not promise the same strength twice. Opium varied, solvents extracted differently depending on time and spirit. Spices hid potency. An apothecary might mix a tincture so robust that a spoonful pulled a person under deeper than intended. Another might stretch the batch to save cost, leaving the suffering uncomforted and reaching for more. The negotiation between doctor and apothecary, between decree and measurement, was not only professional pride, it was safety. But safety, like silence, is something societies often value only after they have lost it. By the time the 19th century arrived and industry began to grind the human body into schedules and quotas, laudanum was already waiting on the shelf. It did not need to introduce itself. It had been part of domestic life for generations. Factories and mines supplied a new kind of demand: crushed fingers, torn muscles, lungs that could not forget the dust they swallowed. Tuberculosis carved away the breath of breadwinners. Neuralgia and rheumatism lingered like unpaid debts. In that world, laudanum was not only relief, it was a way to keep working. A small dose could mean the difference between finishing a shift and losing wages. In the arithmetic of survival, the bottle was both comfort and tool. Across class lines, it performed different duties. For laborers, it was practical, a tired man's private hush. For the middle classes, it was etiquette, a way to manage emotion without breaking the rules of composure. Victorian culture prized restraint. Pain was to be endured, grief was to be dignified. Laudanum offered a compliant escape. One could take it discreetly, then return to conversation with a calm face and a quiet voice. No smoke, no public spectacle, just a softened world. And at the center of that domestic geography were midwives, women who moved between births and deaths, between the most intimate thresholds of human life. They carried laudanum because it was one of the few sedatives available. It could calm contractions, quiet an infant, ease exhaustion, spare a household the scandal of audible suffering. For a society that worshipped decorum, laudanum became a discreet anesthesia for the soul. We at the Forbidden Dispensary have seen the pattern repeated in old ledgers and older whispers. When a culture demands endurance but offers little help, it will praise whatever makes endurance possible. That is the dark softness inside the name. Laudare, to praise. Praised for stilling pain, praised for making the unbearable bearable, praised for keeping people functional, and once praised, it becomes easy to forgive. In the next part, we will follow the bottle as it becomes a household staple, sold openly, folded into patent syrups, carried into nurseries, slipped into pockets, and marketed with tenderness that disguises risk. We will talk about the pleasant lies printed on labels and the quiet harm that traveled with them. For now, stay with the hush. The amber bottle is still on the table, the spoon is still beside it, and the room, if you listen closely, is holding its breath. We keep our records the old way in the forbidden dispensary, not because we distrust progress, but because paper remembers in a particular manner. Ink does not blink. It does not soften the facts out of politeness. If a bottle was sold, the page says so. If a mother came back for another, the page makes room again. And in those pages, one truth repeats until it becomes almost dull with familiarity. Laudanum did not spread through the 19th century as a scandal. It spread as a convenience. By the time Queen Victoria's long reign set the tone of the century, laudanum had already lived through enough generations to feel ordinary. It sat in kitchen cupboards beneath sacks of sugar. It waited in bedside drawers beside handkerchiefs. It traveled in the satchels of midwives and in the coat pockets of men who had learned that pain was expensive. In London, Manchester, Edinburgh, any city with smoke in its air and haste in its streets, chemists stocked it with the calm confidence of sellers who believed they were offering something familiar. Some bottles wore neat printed labels, prim as Sunday clothes. Others still carried handwriting, the apothecary's looping script, a private promise of care. Shopkeepers did not always demand a prescription. Often they did not need to. The remedy had been normalized for so long that buying it felt like buying vinegar or lamp oil, a domestic supply. And then the age of patent medicines arrived like a parade. A century that could mass-produce cloth and nails could also mass-produce reassurance. The market discovered that pain was not only a problem, it was a customer. So the bottle learned to wear costumes: cough syrups, cordials, sleep drafts, soothing mixtures for nerves, for teething, for colic, for grief that had been rebranded as restlessness, bitters that promised vigor to the worn-out body, tonics that claimed to restore what modern life had stolen. Their names were often tender, almost maternal. Their labels carried calm faces, tidy fonts, polite decoration. Their language offered comfort without embarrassment. And inside many of them, hidden in the sweet thickness, was the same old poppy shadow. A dose that could quiet a child, a dose that could quiet a house. In the United States, one of the most famous examples began circulating in the middle of the 19th century. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was marketed to mothers as a gentle answer to teething and fussiness. It promised peace. It delivered it because it carried morphine. In Britain and across its reach, there were similar bottles, sold with the same soft voice. Godfrey's cordial was among the best known, sweet, viscous, and threaded with opium. There were also camphorated tinctures and quieting drops, with names that sounded like family heirlooms rather than commerce. They were sold in grocers' shops and at chemists' counters. They traveled by rail. They rode in crates on ships. They reached rural villages and dense city streets with equal ease. They were not rare. They were not exotic. They were simply there. This is what makes the story so unsettling when you sit with it long enough. The harm did not arrive with drama. It arrived with familiarity. Because laudanum had a strange social genius, it performed different labor depending on who held the bottle. For the factory worker with a crushed thumb or a back that could no longer fully straighten, it was a way to keep earning. A spoonful could buy a few hours of function. In the ledger of survival, that mattered. Industrial work asked for endurance beyond the body's design. Laudanum helped the body pretend. For the respectable household, it did quieter work. Victorian culture demanded composure. Grief was expected to be neat. Pain was expected to be managed. Women were expected to be gentle and steady, even when exhausted. Men were expected to return to work, to provide, to be contained. Laudanum offered a private method of compliance. Take a small amount, lower the volume of the world, go back into the parlor with a calm face. In our shop's old accounts, you can see the pattern without needing names. One bottle, then, weeks later, one bottle, then more often, then a larger size. The handwriting remains polite while the need grows louder. The medical world was changing too, and change did not always mean safety. Chemistry began to refine what had once been a messy botanical tradition. Early in the 19th century, morphine was isolated from opium. That mattered because it separated the active force from the plant's broader mixture. It meant potency could be concentrated and, in theory, made consistent. Then came the needle. By the middle of the century, hypodermic injection became a practical tool. The drug could bypass the stomach and enter the bloodstream directly. What had once been a slow descent through a spoonful became a swift plunge. Tinctures did not vanish. Many people still preferred the familiar bottle that could be taken discreetly without the spectacle of a syringe. It was cheaper, easier, and wrapped in domestic habit. But the medical landscape now contained both forms, the old amber comfort and the new clinical precision. And with that precision came new kinds of dependence, faster, more intimate, harder to deny. Doctors began to argue in journals, reformers began to warn in pamphlets, Parliament began to notice in its slow, bureaucratic way. Yet the market kept selling because the market did not require agreement. It required demand. And demand was everywhere. The language of the time helped. Victorians loved a broad term that could hold many troubles without naming them plainly. Nerves became one of those words. It could mean anxiety, sleeplessness, grief, exhaustion, palpitations, dread, irritability, sadness. It could mean a life that did not fit the expectations pressed upon it. To say my nerves was to confess without detail. And a bottle that promised to soothe nerves could claim a wide territory. Women especially were steered toward quiet remedies. A woman in distress was often treated as a disruption to order. Laudanum could restore order. It could make her calm. It could make her compliant. It could make her presentable. Midwives kept it close for practical reasons. Labor pains, after pains, postpartum fear. But it slid easily from emergency tool to daily habit, especially when the household expected silence more than healing. And then there were the children. The nursery is where the story turns from uneasy to unbearable. A crying baby is not only noise, it is a demand. It is a small creature insisting that someone must respond. In crowded homes, in thin-walled buildings, with exhausted mothers and little support, that demand could become impossible. So the syrups sold themselves as mercy. A spoonful and the baby sleeps. The chemistry that quieted pain also quieted breathing. Infants were and are unforgivingly sensitive to opiates. A dose that seemed small could become too much. Sometimes the child would not wake. Sometimes the child would wake changed. Duller, weaker, slower to feed. Sometimes the harm was gradual enough that it could be mistaken for temperament. Coroners' inquests began to record these tragedies. Newspapers printed them with the appetite newspapers have always had for grief, and the public responded with a mixture of horror and blame. Often the blame fell on mothers, as though a woman alone had invented the market that targeted her exhaustion. But the bottles were everywhere. The labels were sweet. The copy promised safety. The sellers were confident. The culture demanded quiet. A mother's mistake was rarely made in ignorance alone. It was made inside a system that offered her few alternatives. In the forbidden dispensary, we do not excuse what harmed children. We also do not pretend the harm was born from isolated cruelty. Most of the time, it was born from weariness and from the ruthless efficiency of products that delivered immediate results. A quiet house is seductive. That is why laudanum became both balm and snare. It could keep a man working, a woman composed, a baby silent. It could also teach the body to require it, and teach the household to rely on it. And dependence has a way of arriving politely. It does not always slam the door. It often knocks softly, and then stands in the hallway as if it belongs there. In the next part, we will step into the deeper contradictions. The way literature and art turned opium into a kind of aesthetic. The way respectable people began to recognize the habit while still reaching for the bottle. And the way commerce learned to hide danger behind tenderness. For now, listen to the quiet that follows a dose. It is not always peace. Sometimes it is only absence. There is a particular kind of silence that follows laudanum. Not the honest silence of sleep, earned by a clean tiredness. This is a manufactured hush, a quiet that arrives too quickly and settles too heavily, like a curtain dropped in the middle of a sentence. In the forbidden dispensary, we learned to recognize it by the way customers stood at the counter. Some came with a steady hand and a practiced tone, as if ordering the same item each week proved nothing. Others spoke too brightly, too casually, the way people do when they are trying to convince themselves. And some did not speak much at all. They simply placed coins down, eyes lowered, and waited for the bottle that would make the day manageable. That word, manageable, was one of laudanum's great disguises. Pain did not need to be cured. It only needed to be made small enough to carry. And the 19th century was an era that required carrying. Industry demanded it. Etiquette demanded it. Religion, in many homes, demanded it too. Bear your lot, keep your composure, do not make a spectacle of suffering. So the bottle became a private method of obedience. But then, as the century aged, the bottle began to gain a second life, one that was not domestic, not respectable, not tidy. A life that made people stare at the remedy with a mixture of fascination and disgust. The artists arrived, not first, but loudest. When a culture is saturated with a substance, it will eventually produce stories about it. Not because the substance is rare, but because it is common enough to shape dreams. In Britain, Thomas de Quincey did something that polite society hated and could not stop reading. He wrote about opium as pleasure, as terror, as a private geography of dependence. He did not write like a pamphleteer. He wrote like a man describing weather inside his own skull. His sentences moved in long, drifting currents, and his images made the reader feel the seduction even while he confessed the cost. And the confession mattered. It gave the habit a public face that was not confined to slums or criminal courts. Here was a man who could write beautifully, educated, articulate, admitting that he was tethered to a bottle. It shattered a comforting lie. The lie was that only the weak, only the immoral, only the poor would be caught. But opium did not respect social rank. It did not care about table manners. Another name followed like a shadow, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. His laudanum use became stitched into the way people spoke about him, as if the bottle explained the brilliance and excused the wreckage. His lines were quoted with reverence, and the whisper always followed, opium. As though poetry and poppy sap were married by fate. This is where laudanum gained its most dangerous costume, the idea of the muse. The notion that a drug could open doors in the mind, widen perception, loosen the strict bolts of ordinary thought. For some readers and young writers, that idea was not a warning. It was an invitation. Not everyone swallowed the invitation, but the myth settled into the culture anyway, and myths have consequences. In France, Charles Baudelaire wrote about artificial paradises, mapping intoxication with a critic's eye and a poet's hunger. He did not pretend it was harmless. He understood that the pleasure could be bright and the aftermath could be bleak. Still, the very act of writing about it, of giving it language that sounded rich, helped turn private dependence into public fascination. And fascination is not neutral. It sells. Publishers learned that opium confessions moved copies. Papers learned that opium dens moved attention. A culture that had been quietly sipping laudanum at home began to crave a more theatrical image of the drug. This is where the story grows crooked. Because the domestic bottle was plain and respectable, but the public imagination wanted vice with scenery. It wanted the exotic. It wanted a room full of smoke, foreign carpets, shadowy figures. It wanted to believe that the real danger lived elsewhere. So the image of the opium den took hold. In port cities, in districts where sailors and migrants lived close to the edge of respectability, opium-smoking rooms did exist. They were not always as ornate as the novels claimed. Often they were cramped, dirty, practical, but they provided a stage for the Victorian mind to project fears about empire, race, and moral decay. The respectable household could point at the den and say, "That is where the problem is," all while keeping laudanum in the bedside drawer. This division, our medicine, their vice, was one of the century's favorite self-deceptions. Meanwhile, the medical profession was trying to name what it was seeing. At first, the language was soft. Habit. Habituation. Words that made dependence sound like preference, like a stubborn taste rather than a bodily trap. But the trap had mechanics, even if the Victorians did not yet have modern terms for it. They knew what tolerance looked like. They knew what withdrawal looked like. They knew, in blunt daily practice, that a dose that once soothed could become a dose that barely held a person together. A patient would begin with a few drops for sleep, then need more, then need it earlier. then need it to feel normal. Then, when it was absent, the body would revolt. Doctors wrote case notes that read like quiet despair: sweating, shaking, stomach turning, sleeplessness like punishment, a mind snapping at every small noise. The world did not simply return. It returned sharper, meaner, louder. And yet doctors still prescribed opiates because they were not wrong to want to relieve suffering. For severe pain, for relentless cough, for the jagged misery of certain diseases, opiates were among the few tools that truly worked. So the profession became divided, not into villains and saints, but into uneasy camps. Some warned against overuse, some defended the remedy as mercy. Many did both, depending on the patient in front of them. This is a truth that makes people uncomfortable. A drug can be both a gift and a trap, and the same physician can be both compassionate and careless without intending harm. The argument was not confined to medical journals, it spilled into politics. In Britain, the state began to notice the scale of opiate use and the chaos of unregulated sale. The Pharmacy Act, passed in the latter half of the 19th century, was one attempt to bring order, to insist that certain substances should be sold by trained hands, recorded, handled with more caution. It did not erase laudanum, it did not slam the cabinet door shut, but it shifted the culture slightly. It made the bottle less casual. It marked it, quietly, as something the state considered dangerous enough to track. Still, the market adapted. Patent medicines continued to slip through gaps. Labels remained vague. Euphemisms remained profitable. And profit deserves its own sentence here, because the opium economy was not only domestic, it was imperial. The poppy fields that fed Britain's medicine cabinets were not growing in English gardens. They grew in colonial soil, organized and harvested at scale. Opium was money. It was trade leverage. It was a commodity that moved through shipping lanes and ledgers with the steady indifference of commerce. A bottle on a nightstand in London was linked by invisible chain to a field far away where labor was controlled and profits were counted elsewhere. This is not a sentimental observation. It is logistics. It is the anatomy of supply. And supply shapes habit. When a substance is abundant, it will be used. When it is profitable, it will be marketed. When it is wrapped in soft language, it will be forgiven. In the forbidden dispensary, we keep one old advertising card behind glass. The paper is yellowed and the ink has faded, but the message is still readable. It promises calm nights. It promises relief from cough. It promises that the remedy is safe, gentle, reliable. The card does not mention opium. It does not mention morphine. It does not mention how easy it is for a body to learn the taste of silence. That is what commerce did best. It sold the effect while hiding the cause. The public's relationship with laudanum began to split. On one side, the bottle remained a domestic tool, still praised for keeping life orderly. On the other, it became a cultural symbol of decadent vice, of artistic torment, of exotic danger. Neither image was fully honest. Both were useful to someone, and beneath both images, the ordinary reality continued. People took it because they hurt. In the next part, we will go closer to the mechanics, how the drug changes the body, why alcohol made the tincture more treacherous, and how the move from spoon to needle changed the speed and scale of dependence. We will also step into the wartime aftermath that helped the modern world finally admit what the Victorians had only half named. For now, keep the room quiet. The bottle is still here, and the sentry, even at its most confident, never fully knew whether it was holding medicine or a slow lesson in regret. In our back room at the forbidden dispensary, there is a drawer that sticks. You have to pull it with patience, not force, or it will jam and refuse you entirely. Inside that drawer are old measuring spoons, thin, worn metal, the kind that once lived in kitchen tins and doctor's bags. They look harmless. They always did. That was the danger. The laudanum century was built on small measures, a few drops, a half spoon. A spoon and a swallow, then a sigh that sounded like gratitude. People like to imagine addiction as a dramatic door you walk through. A single reckless choice, a single bad night. But most of the time it came as arithmetic. Quiet, repeating arithmetic. A daily habit that made sense in the moment, then made sense again the next day, until the body began to insist. To understand why the bottle could soothe so well and trap so quietly, you have to understand that laudanum was never just opium. It was opium dissolved in alcohol. That detail sounds plain, almost dull, until you place it next to what the body does with it. Alcohol was the solvent, yes. It pulled the active compounds out of the poppy resin and held them in liquid form. But it also carried its own force, warmth, looseness, a gentle blurring. Combined with opium, alcohol did not merely accompany the drug. It joined it, it pressed in the same direction, a second hand pushing the same lever. That is why laudanum could feel like comfort so quickly. Not only because pain faded, but because the edges of feeling softened too. The mind stopped resisting the room. Sleep arrived with less argument, and that is also why the bottle could become lethal in a way that looked from the outside like simple rest. The body's most basic rhythm, breathing, does not rely only on will. It relies on automatic drive, a quiet engine in the brain that keeps the lungs moving even when the mind is far away. Opiates turn that engine down. Alcohol turns it down as well. Together, they can lower breathing so much that the body simply does not correct itself. A person can drift into deeper quiet than intended. A hush that does not end. Victorian doctors did not speak in modern receptor terms, but they observed the pattern. They knew certain doses made the patient's pupils tiny. They knew cough reflex could vanish. They knew constipation followed as faithfully as night follows day. They knew too that some patients returned again and again, not for pain relief alone, but because they had begun to need the drug to feel normal. That need had a shape. At first, the dose works beautifully. Pain is dulled, sleep is granted, the nerves stop their constant twitching. But the body adjusts. It learns. It adapts to the presence of the drug, shifting its own settings in order to keep balance. Then the same dose feels weaker. So the person takes a little more, a modest increase. Reasonable, they tell themselves. After all, they did hurt. After all, they did need sleep. After all, the last dose had helped. This is how the bottle gains power. It does not conquer, it negotiates, and the negotiation is always tilted. Because the body is not bargaining for morals. It is bargaining for chemistry. When the drug is withheld after regular use, the body swings hard the other way. Restlessness, sweating, a stomach that turns itself inside out. Shivers, yawning, tears that come without sadness, sleep that vanishes, pain that returns louder than before, as if insulted by the brief silence. The Victorians knew this too. They described it in case notes. Sometimes they wrote with cold precision. Sometimes the writing slipped into a tone that sounded almost ashamed, as though the physician felt responsible for what he could not fully prevent. And then the century handed the opium story a new instrument, the needle. Before injection became common, laudanum moved through the mouth. It had to pass digestion, absorption, time. That slowness mattered. It placed a small delay between dose and effect. It gave the body a chance to protest. It gave the person a chance sometimes to reconsider. Injection removed the delay. In the middle decades of the 19th century, practical hypodermic syringes appeared, and with them a new kind of intimacy between drug and bloodstream. Morphine could now arrive fast and clean, without the taste of bitter tincture, without the smell of spirit, without the domestic ritual of the spoon. It looked modern. It looked precise. It looked safe because it looked controlled. But speed changes everything. The quicker the effect, the more strongly the brain learns the association. Relief becomes a reflex. The body begins to crave not just the drug, but the suddenness of its arrival. In our ledgers, you can see the shift reflected indirectly. The old purchases remain, of course. Laudanum does not disappear, but alongside it appear new entries. Morphine preparations, syringes, sterile tools. The cabinet grows more clinical. The comfort becomes more engineered. And then war made the scale undeniable. In the United States, the Civil War tore bodies apart in numbers that modern people still struggle to picture. Field hospitals needed fast relief. Surgeons needed a way to blunt agony and keep men still enough to survive treatment. Morphine did what it does. It worked. But when the wounds healed, the drug sometimes stayed. Veterans returned home with a dependence that had not begun as vice. It had begun as mercy. Medical journals began to speak of soldier's disease, a phrase that tried to hold the grim truth without fully blaming the men who carried it. This was one of the first times large numbers of people in the public eye were recognized as dependent because of medical practice itself. Not because of moral failure, not because of criminal intent, because modern medicine had given relief, and relief had consequences. The Victorian world, on both sides of the Atlantic, had to absorb a hard lesson. Control of pain is never only a technical act. It is also a social act. It changes families. It changes work. It changes what a person believes they can endure. Meanwhile, the patent medicine market kept moving bottles with sweet names and vague labels. Chemistry was refining drugs in laboratories while commerce was disguising them on shelves. Two forces moving in opposite directions, one toward clarity, the other toward concealment. The result was a public that consumed opiates in several different ways at once. First, the household bottle taken by spoon. Second, the branded syrup taken with trust. Third, the injection taken under medical supervision or taken alone once the tools were available. Each path had its own pace, each created its own kind of dependency, but all led to the same central truth: the body learns. And when the body learns, it begins to demand. The medical profession argued about ethics, and it was not an idle argument. Physicians had to decide again and again whether to prioritize immediate relief or long-term risk. Some patients were dying of consumption, coughing themselves raw through the night. Laudanum could give them rest. Was it cruel to deny that comfort because of a future dependence that might not matter? Other patients were healthy enough to live long with the habit. A bottle that began as a remedy could become a lifelong tether. Was it cruel to provide the tether because it made the present easier? There is no tidy answer. That is why the argument lasted. And while doctors debated, families improvised. A mother with no money for repeated consultations might ration a bottle to last the month. An apothecary might dilute a batch to keep costs down. A neighbor might share drops from her own supply, passing the remedy like sugar. The ordinary nature of these exchanges is what made the harm so widespread. It was not confined to a single class, a single street, a single kind of person. It was woven into daily life. In the next part, we will step into the places where that weaving became visible enough to scandalize: coroners' courts, inquests, and the slow rise of toxicology. We will talk about how difficult it was to prove an opiate death when the drug was legal, common, and often indistinguishable from sleep. We will follow the bottle into the courtroom and watch science learn to speak in a language juries could understand. For now, keep your attention on the spoon in the drawer. It is not dramatic. It is not glamorous. It is only a measure. And history, more often than not, is built on what people measure without thinking. There is a point where a household remedy stops being a private matter, not because the bottle changes, but because the consequences become public. That is when the coroner arrives. In Victorian cities, death was common enough to be almost ordinary, but certain deaths still made a room feel colder. A child found too still in the morning, a boarder who went to bed and never rose, a woman discovered on a sofa with no sign of struggle, only a faint sweetness on the breath and a bottle on the side table. Laudanum could make death look like rest. That was the problem. In the early decades, proving an opiate death was not simple. Laudanum was legal. Laudanum was everywhere, and its effects, sleep, slowed breathing, a fading away, could resemble natural decline to an untrained eye. Even when suspicion stirred, the tools of proof were limited. So inquests began with the same small questions. Who bought the bottle? How much was taken? Who was in the room? Was there grief? Was there debt? Was there a quarrel? The legal world needed motives because chemistry could not always offer certainty. At the forbidden dispensary, we have copies of old notices, thin paper, blocky type, summoning witnesses to speak about deaths sudden or unexpected. And if you read enough of them, you start to recognize the recurring shape. A death that is too quiet invites the suspicion that someone arranged the quiet. But laudanum complicated everything because it had a respectable alibi. It could be there for cough, for pain, for sleep, for nerves. To possess it was not incriminating. To have taken it was not by itself a crime. This blurred the line between accident and intention. A grieving person could swallow too much, a tired mother could mismeasure, a nurse could dose too freely, convinced she was doing good. A caretaker could use the bottle as a weapon and claim it was medicine. And in a society that prized composure, the quietness of an opiate death could even look dignified. Coroners and juries had to sort dignity from danger. That sorting depended increasingly on a growing field that Victorians came to respect with a mix of awe and unease: toxicology. Poison had always existed, but the 19th century began to insist that poison could be proven, not merely guessed at, not merely rumored, but demonstrated in court. That was an intellectual shift, and it changed legal outcomes. In France, Mathieu Orfila helped set the foundation for modern forensic toxicology, arguing that chemical methods and careful observation could identify poisons in the body. In Britain, Alfred Swain Taylor became a name that carried weight in courtrooms, a man who could translate laboratory work into testimony a jury might accept. But opiates remained tricky. Unlike some poisons that left dramatic signs, opiates left softness, sleepiness, a slowing, a stillness. And after death, the body's processes could muddy chemical traces, especially when time had passed or conditions were poor. Even when morphine had been isolated as a pure substance in laboratories, finding it in a corpse was not always straightforward. The methods were painstaking: extraction, precipitation, careful handling. It required skilled hands and good equipment, and many inquests did not have either. So the court leaned again on circumstance: the bottle on the table, the witness who saw a purchase, the neighbor who heard an argument the night before, the servant who noticed a label had been replaced, the pharmacist who remembered the buyer's face. In some cases, those clues were enough. In others, they were not. Verdicts could hinge on reputation, on class, on whether the accused looked like someone a jury could imagine as a poisoner. It is an ugly truth, but the 19th century was not immune to bias. It often dressed bias up as common sense. Still, science kept pushing forward, and each improvement made laudanum's legal camouflage thinner. As toxicology matured, expert witnesses became more confident. They began to connect symptom patterns to opiate dosing: deep stupor, constricted pupils, slow breathing, and the particular way a person might sink rather than convulse. They could not always show a clean laboratory signature the way modern methods can, but they could present a coherent story built from physiology and observation. And coherent stories persuade juries. So the courtroom became one of the places where laudanum's reputation shifted. Not in the parlor, not in the nursery, but under oath, with the bottle held up like evidence rather than comfort. This shift did not happen only in sensational murder trials. It also happened in the steady drip of accidental deaths, especially among children. A baby was given a syrup to quiet teething. A toddler found a bottle that had not been corked properly. A dose intended as small turned out to be stronger than the last bottle from the same shop. These were not always dramatic scandals. Sometimes they were simply tragedies with paperwork. But paperwork accumulates, and accumulated paperwork becomes policy pressure. Newspapers fed the pressure, often with a tone that mixed sympathy and moral scolding. Some articles portrayed mothers as reckless. Others hinted at poverty, exhaustion, the brutal lack of support. Few were willing to accuse the manufacturers directly with the same heat they used on grieving women. Yet the manufacturers had designed the system. Sweet labels, vague ingredients, strong effects. The bottle was engineered to be trusted. And then there was the darker corner, the one polite society preferred to speak about in whispers: infant farming. In an age of poverty and social stigma, unwanted infants were sometimes handed to paid caretakers. The arrangement could be framed as practical charity, but it also created a market where neglect and cruelty could thrive. Some caretakers kept babies alive, others did not. And in the ugliest cases, opiates were used to quiet infants until quiet became permanent. Not every case relied on laudanum, but enough did that the association hardened in public imagination. Opiates were not only medicine now, they were also, in public fear, a tool for concealed harm. That fear pushed reformers and legislators toward control. Britain's Pharmacy Act, in the latter half of the century, was one step toward professionalizing who could sell strong substances and how they had to be recorded. It did not eliminate patent medicine deception, but it signaled the state's growing discomfort with unrestricted access. The point was not only moral, it was logistical. When a substance is widely distributed, mistakes scale up. When mistakes scale up, the state begins to see the pattern as a governance problem. We have seen this pattern in every era, with every powerful remedy that becomes common. The bottle spreads first, the harm becomes visible later. The rules arrive last, as if society is always a few steps behind its own habits. In the back of our shop, there is a thin folder labeled simply "Inquests." No names on the outside. Inside are clippings and handwritten notes, the kind a cautious dispenser might keep. One line appears again and again, in different handwriting, different towns. Found asleep, could not be roused. Those words could be harmless. They could also be the beginning of a criminal case. This is what laudanum did to the legal imagination. It made sleep suspicious. And suspicion, once established, spreads as relentlessly as the drug itself. In the next part, we will follow the bottle back through its supply lines, out of the parlor and into the empire that made it cheap enough to be everywhere. We will talk about the poppy fields, the trade machinery, and how a domestic remedy became bound to colonial revenue and global commerce. The bedside bottle will start to look less like a private comfort and more like a node in a much larger network. For now, let the image settle. A quiet room, a quiet death, and a public official leaning over the stillness, asking the same question again and again. Was it mercy? Was it mistake? Or was it intention hidden in amber glass? If you want to understand why laudanum became so ordinary, do not start in the parlor. Start far from it, where a field is not a pastoral scene, but an account book written in plants. Because the Victorian bottle did not begin as a Victorian bottle, it began as sap, a scored poppy head weeping latex that darkened in the air. A sticky harvest, gathered by hands that would never see the drawing rooms where the finished tincture would later be sipped behind lace curtains. The forbidden dispensary has always believed that medicine carries the shape of its supply lines, not only in chemistry but in consequence. Follow the route and you will find the cost. By the 19th century, opium was not merely an herb or an apothecary's ingredient. It was an imperial commodity, organized on a scale that earlier centuries could not have managed. In British India, poppy cultivation was overseen with bureaucratic patience. Fields were not simply planted, they were administered. Contracts were written, quotas were expected. The harvest was collected, weighed, pressed, and moved into warehouses. From there, it traveled to auction and onward to ships. It is tempting to frame this as distant politics, but it is not distant from the bedside. The abundance that filled British and American shops came from this machinery. When something is made cheap and regular, it stops feeling dangerous. It starts feeling normal. And normal is the most powerful disguise a drug can wear. One reason opium became so widely available was that it served more than one market. Europe used it for medicine, port cities used it for sailors and laborers. Patent medicine makers used it for profit. And in East Asia, traders pushed it as a commodity that could be exchanged for goods, influence, and leverage. Trade is rarely gentle when it finds a substance people will crave. The 19th century made that cruelty visible in a way that still raises the hair on the back of the neck, even if you try to read it like dry history. In the Chinese market, opium was not simply an import. It became a crisis. The Qing state saw social damage and economic drain. Efforts were made to stop the inflow. Chests were confiscated and destroyed. Officials tried to cut the supply line. The British response was war. Not because opium was sacred, but because commerce had decided it was necessary. The dates and battles are recorded elsewhere in neat lists. But we do not deal in neatness tonight. We deal in meaning. And the meaning is this. A plant was turned into policy, and policy was enforced with cannon. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the domestic market kept humming. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The same empire that fought to protect opium trade abroad also allowed opium preparations to circulate at home with remarkable ease for much of the century. The substance was framed as medicine in the domestic sphere and as commerce in the imperial sphere, but the chemical reality did not change simply because the label did. And then there was the American market, which grew fat on patent medicines of its own. Bottles crossed the Atlantic. Formulas were copied, brands were invented. The railroads did what railroads always do. They made distribution fast and ordinary. A remedy that once required a skilled apothecary and a local reputation could now be purchased with coins in a town that had never heard the name Paracelsus. And this is where the supply chain becomes a kind of trap. Because when a drug is everywhere, it becomes woven into routine. It enters households the way soap enters households. Not as a rare event, but as something you keep on hand because life is unpredictable. Factories created injuries, cities created cough, poverty created exhaustion. Social rules created silent despair. Laudanum met all of it. So did its relatives. Cordials, syrups, tinctures disguised as gentle help. The forbidden dispensary has a shipping record from a supplier, faded ink, soft paper, the kind that tears if you handle it too often. It is not dramatic. It lists crates, it lists weights, it lists destinations. But if you read it with the right attention, you can see the invisible story. Opium moving like any other commodity. Like tea, like cotton, like sugar. And that comparison is not accidental. Sugar and opium shared something beyond trade routes. They shared a talent for being folded into daily life until people forgot they were consuming an empire. A spoonful in the morning, a spoonful at night. It was never framed as surrender. It was framed as care. This is why regulation struggled. Not only because of profit, but because of cultural entanglement. When Parliament or reformers tried to tighten the rules, they were not merely challenging a drug. They were challenging habits that had become domestic tradition. They were challenging the idea that a mother had the right to soothe her child without interference. They were challenging the working man's small method of staying upright. They were challenging a whole society's private tools for coping. No one likes to be told that their coping mechanism is dangerous, especially when no replacement is offered. That is the second great lesson of the Laudanum century. If you restrict relief without providing alternatives, the need does not vanish. It migrates, it finds new channels. The market always finds new channels first. Patent medicine makers were masters at this. If a law demanded certain sales be more controlled, the bottle could be renamed, diluted, sweetened, marketed as something else. If medical authorities warned about laudanum, advertisements could shift toward cordials, drops, restoratives, the language of gentleness. And the public, exhausted and busy, often did not demand clarity. They demanded effect. This is not because people were foolish. It is because pain makes philosophers out of almost no one. Pain makes pragmatists. Still, pressure built. Medical journals began to record dependence more openly. Reformers gathered inquests and case reports. Newspapers published tragedies. The state began to see not a series of isolated misfortunes, but a pattern. And once a pattern is visible, bureaucracy begins to grow teeth. In Britain, the late 19th century saw more formal control over who could sell powerful substances. Training and registration became harder to avoid. Record-keeping became part of the trade. The bottle did not disappear, but it became slightly more watched. In the United States, that kind of federal control lagged behind. The patent medicine industry was enormous and politically influential, but by the turn of the century, public impatience grew. Investigative writing and scientific testing began to expose what was in the bottles. The idea that a label should tell the truth started to look less like a nuisance and more like a right. Truth on a label is not merely information, it is a form of protection. It is also, for manufacturers, a threat to profit, because once you name opium, you also name risk. You invite scrutiny. You invite stigma. You invite regulation. That is why the industry fought clarity so fiercely, and why reformers had to keep pushing. In our shop, we have always believed that the real battle over drugs is rarely fought in the body alone. It is fought in language. A bottle that says soothing invites trust. A bottle that says opium invites caution. The chemistry is the same, the public response changes. In the next part, we will step into the early 20th century turn, when labeling laws and new national controls began to reshape access, pushing opiates out of the casual marketplace and into medical paperwork. We will also watch how a new molecule, marketed with confidence, tried to replace older opium preparations and ended up repeating the same old mistake under a new name. For now, hold the map in your mind. A poppy field, a warehouse, a ship, a chemist's shelf, a bedside drawer. A straight line of commerce ending in a spoon. And the most unsettling truth is that every link in that chain could claim innocence. Each person handled only their portion. Farmer, clerk, merchant, dispenser, mother, patient. Yet the chain as a whole produced a world where relief was abundant, and so was dependence. That is the shape of Laudanum's empire. There is a moment in every long habit when a society looks up and realizes it has been doing something for years without fully naming it. For the opium world, that moment came slowly, like dawn behind heavy curtains. In the late 19th century and into the early 20th, the language began to harden. Habit no longer sounded quaint. Dependence no longer sounded like a personal weakness alone. Governments began to understand that the bottle was not just a household matter. It was a market. It was a public health concern. It was a political problem. And politics, when it finally moves with paperwork. At the Forbidden Dispensary, we have seen how a single new form can change a whole city's behavior. A ledger requirement, a poison register, a signature line. These are not romantic objects, but they are powerful. They turn casual purchase into documented transaction. They force the seller to pause. They force the buyer to admit, at least to themselves, that the thing they want is not merely comfort. In Britain, the 19th century had already begun this slow tightening. Professional pharmacy had grown more organized, and laws began to define who could sell what and under what conditions. It was not a sudden ban, it was a gradual narrowing, moving opiates away from the grocer's shelf and toward the pharmacist's counter, and then toward the physician's authority. In the United States, the shift took a different route, but it arrived at a similar destination. For decades, patent medicines had flooded the American marketplace. Bottles promised relief from everything a human body can suffer. Their labels were cheerful, their ingredients were often undisclosed. Their effects, when opiates were involved, were undeniable. But by the turn of the century, public patience began to fray. People did not like learning that they had been drinking alcohol and opiates under names that sounded like kindness. Reform came, as it often does, when embarrassment finally becomes political pressure. The Pure Food and Drug Act, passed in the early years of the 20th century, began to force a new kind of honesty. It was not perfect, and it was not immediate salvation, but it mattered. It demanded that certain ingredients be named, that interstate commerce could not sell outright lies with impunity. Naming changes everything. A mother might buy soothing syrup without fear. A mother might hesitate if the label admits morphine. The same bottle, newly honest, becomes harder to sell. And then came a deeper tightening, an act that reshaped the American landscape of opiates. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed in the second decade of the century. It was on paper about taxation and registration. In practice, it pulled opiates into a system of control. Manufacturers, importers, pharmacists, physicians, anyone handling certain narcotics had to register, keep records, account for supply. It changed the flow. It also changed the social meaning. A drug that had been a casual household tool became something tracked. Something that could trigger legal trouble. Something whose possession and distribution were no longer merely personal decisions, but regulated acts. Here is the part history rarely says plainly enough. Regulation does not erase desire, it rearranges it. When access tightened, many people who were dependent did not become suddenly free. They became suddenly desperate. Some found physicians willing to manage their use carefully. Some were cut off and suffered. Some turned to informal markets. Some shifted from one substance to another, searching not for pleasure, but for normality. This is how black markets are born, not only from greed, but from the collision of need and restriction. Meanwhile, chemistry kept advancing, and modern industry did what it always does with a market problem. It tried to invent a cleaner solution. In the last years of the 19th century, a new opiate was introduced with striking confidence. It was marketed as modern, effective, even safe. It carried a name that suggested strength, courage, capability. Heroin. It was first promoted as a cough suppressant, and with astonishing boldness, as a remedy that might be less habit-forming than morphine. In an era hungry for scientific progress, this claim found eager listeners. Physicians wanted tools, patients wanted relief. Manufacturers wanted a product that could be sold as improvement. The forbidden dispensary has always been wary of improvement that arrives with glossy certainty. When a drug is introduced as the answer to the last drug's harm, suspicion is appropriate. The body does not care about marketing language, it responds to molecules. Heroin delivered the familiar opiate effect, often more quickly, more intensely. It relieved cough, it relieved pain. It also, in many cases, built dependence with ruthless efficiency. So the cycle repeated. A new name, an old promise, the same trap in a slightly different shape. And as these new pharmaceutical forces emerged, laudanum began to drift in social status. It did not vanish overnight. It lingered, particularly in places where tradition runs deep and regulation runs light. But it was no longer the modern face of opiates. It was increasingly seen as old-fashioned, a relic of the Victorian cupboard. Yet relics can be stubborn. Older people kept their habits. Rural communities kept familiar remedies. Some pharmacies continued to compound tinctures. Some households continued to pass down recipes and advice the way they passed down quilts and stories. Still, the center of gravity moved. The 20th century began to push opiates into stricter medical channels. A physician's authority became more central. A pharmacist's ledger became more exact. Import and distribution faced more oversight. International agreements began to treat opium not only as trade, but as a transnational concern. This international turn mattered because the supply lines had always been international. You cannot regulate a drug that crosses oceans without treaties, and treaties are slow. But slow does not mean meaningless. Conferences and commissions began to frame opium control as a global responsibility. Some of that framing was sincere public health concern. Some was political theater. Some was shaped by racial fear and colonial hypocrisy. But it marked a shift. Opium was no longer merely a household tool. It was now officially recognized as a substance capable of reshaping populations. And then there was the human side, the part no law can fully handle. Even as regulation tightened, doctors still faced the same old ethical problem. People hurt, people cough, people break, people grieve. Remove opiates entirely, and you do not remove suffering. You only remove one method of managing it. So physicians became gatekeepers in a way that was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because powerful drugs require oversight. Dangerous because gatekeeping creates power, and power invites misuse, bias, and neglect. Some patients, especially those already marginalized, found it harder to access legitimate pain relief. Others found themselves labeled suspicious simply for needing medication. Meanwhile, those with status or connections could often obtain what they wanted through private channels. Regulation can reduce harm. It can also distribute harm unevenly. This is another repeating lesson, and it belongs to every era. In our own records at the forbidden dispensary, the early 20th century looks like a narrowing corridor. Fewer casual sales, more documentation, more notes written in the margin, warnings, reminders, calculations. The work becomes less like shopkeeping and more like policing, even when the intention is care. And still the same faces appear. The exhausted mother, the injured laborer, the sleepless widow, the coughing patient with hollow cheeks. The modern state can change the supply chain. It cannot erase human need. In the next part, we will return to the intimate spaces again, back to the home and the body, and follow how gender, respectability, and medical paternalism shaped who was believed, who was soothed, and who was blamed. We will look more closely at how nerves became a catch-all diagnosis and how opiates fit into that language as both comfort and control. For now, remember this: the laudanum century did not end with a dramatic final bottle poured down the sink. It ended with forms, with registers, with labels forced to tell the truth. It ended with the quiet realization that the world had been drugging itself in plain sight, and that once seen, it could not be unseen. We have always known, at the forbidden dispensary, that a diagnosis can be a cage disguised as a description. Give a person a label, and you can stop listening to their story. You can file them away. You can treat their suffering as predictable, manageable, almost impersonal. The 19th century loved labels, especially for women. A woman who cried too much was delicate. A woman who could not sleep was high-strung. A woman who was angry was hysterical. A woman who was exhausted was nervous. Those words were not only medical, they were social. They were instructions about how a woman should behave and what should be done to her when she did not. And this is where laudanum did some of its quietest work, because laudanum was not only taken for pain you could point to on a body. It was taken for feelings, feelings that were not allowed to be loud. The Victorian home was built on performance. Respectability was a form of labor. A woman was expected to keep the household smooth, calm, orderly. She was expected to host, to soothe children, to endure pregnancy, childbirth, postpartum fear, and grief without breaking the surface of propriety. When she failed, the culture did not always ask what had broken her. It asked how to quiet her. The medical profession offered many answers, but the simplest one was the bottle. A few drops for sleep, a measured spoon for nerves, a tincture mixed into tea so it looked like care rather than control. This is how medicine can become an instrument of governance. Not always cruelly, often gently, often with sincere intent to relieve suffering. But intent does not erase effect. If the goal is to restore a woman to function, rather than to understand why she is falling apart, then a sedative fits neatly into the task. Midwives were caught in the middle of this. They did not have the luxury of theory. They had blood on their hands. They had screaming rooms. They had women gripping bedposts, biting cloth, trying not to be heard by neighbors through thin walls. They had infants who would not stop crying and mothers who had not slept for days. In that world, laudanum could feel like mercy. A midwife could calm labor pains enough to allow rest. She could ease after pains. She could quiet postpartum anxiety that came like a wave and threatened to drown a woman in shame. She could, in a cramped working-class home, help a mother stay quiet enough to preserve respectability in a world that punished visible suffering. We do not romanticize that. We also do not dismiss it. For many women, laudanum was one of the few reliable sedatives available. It was cheap. It was portable. It worked quickly. It did not require special equipment. It did not require a doctor's constant presence, but the same ease that made it useful also made it dangerous, because women learned, often by necessity, to manage themselves. A bottle in a drawer became a private way to keep going, a private way to keep the house running even when the woman inside it was hollowed out. And hollowing is rarely obvious at first. It can look like composure. It can look like calm. It can look like a woman finally behaving as she should. This is one of laudanum's bleakest ironies. It could make a person seem better to everyone else while quietly binding them to a substance they would later struggle to live without. Victorian doctors wrote about the opium habit, and they often did so with a tone that shifted depending on the patient's gender and class. A man who used laudanum might be described as unfortunate, injured, overworked. A woman who used it might be described as weak, morally suspect, emotionally unstable. The drug was the same. The judgment was not. This difference mattered because it shaped who was offered compassion and who was offered scolding. It shaped who was treated as a patient and who was treated as a problem. And it shaped who had to hide. Women hid their doses behind domestic routines. Drops in tea, a spoon taken in the pantry, a cordial kept among harmless bottles so no visitor would notice. Secrecy is not always deception. Sometimes it is survival in a culture that punishes need. The language of nerves helped that secrecy because it could mean almost anything and therefore could be discussed without detail. A woman could say she was taking something for her nerves and no one would ask what exactly was wrong. No one would have to name grief, loneliness, marital cruelty, postpartum despair, or the simple crushing fatigue of a life that offered no rest. Nerves became a polite veil over the brutal facts of human feeling, and laudanum slid under that veil with ease. In the late 19th century, medical fashion offered other tools that often sounded scientific, but carried the same goal: manage the woman, restore function, preserve order. The rest cure became infamous, isolating women, limiting their activity, controlling their reading and writing, feeding them until their bodies were heavy and their spirits quieter. It was framed as treatment. It often felt like confinement. Against that backdrop, laudanum could appear almost kind. At least it did not lock the door. At least it did not require a clinic. It simply dulled the edges, but dulling can become a way of life. In our files, we have a copy of a letter. No name, no address, only a folded page that someone once left behind. It reads like a voice trying to sound calm while describing collapse. The writer speaks of sleepless nights, of a mind that will not stop turning, of a husband who says she is overwrought. She mentions drops that help her rest. She does not name them, but the language is familiar. The careful avoidance, the shame beneath the politeness. The letter ends with a line that still feels sharp. I only take enough to be myself again. That is what dependence sounds like at the beginning. Not indulgence, restoration, to be myself again. But the self that returns after repeated dosing is not quite the same self. It is a self adjusted by chemistry. It is a self that may begin to require the drug in order to feel ordinary. And then the ordinary becomes impossible without it. Now we must speak again of children, because the gendered story of laudanum cannot be separated from the nursery. Victorian society placed enormous pressure on mothers to produce quiet households. A crying baby was not only distress, it was seen as failure. A woman who could not calm her infant was judged, sometimes harshly, sometimes subtly, but always in a way that made the problem feel personal instead of structural. So soothing syrups thrived. They were marketed with tenderness and moral reassurance. A calm infant meant a good mother. A sleeping child meant a well-run home. The bottle offered not only sleep, but validation, and that validation could be intoxicating. We have already spoken of the tragedies, and we will not linger over them for spectacle, but we must acknowledge the grim truth. A drug that depresses breathing can kill infants. The margin between enough and too much is thin, especially when the bottle's strength varies or when the caregiver does not know what is inside. Victorian inquests recorded the results. Reformers shouted, newspapers scolded, and still the products sold. Because the need did not vanish, and the bottle delivered immediate results. This is the pattern again. A society sets impossible expectations, then sells chemical solutions, then blames individuals when the solutions cause harm. It happened with mothers. It happened with working men. It happened with the ill. It happened with anyone whose suffering was inconvenient to the social order. And laudanum, so polite and portable, fit perfectly into that machine. In the next part, we will step into the public fights that grew from these private harms. The campaigns for labeling, the moral arguments, the rise of reform organizations, and the way fear of opiates became tangled with fear of certain communities. We will watch how compassion, prejudice, and policy braided together into the early modern drug laws. For now, keep one thought close. When a culture calls a woman nervous, it is often saying that her pain is not allowed to change anything. And when a culture hands her laudanum, it is often asking her to disappear quietly enough that the household can go on. The bottle does not shout. It never did. It only asks, gently, for another dose. By the time the 19th century began to tip into the 20th, the room was no longer quiet about opiates. The quiet still existed, behind bedroom doors, in nursery corners, in the private panic of people who could not sleep without help. But outside those doors, the argument grew louder. Reformers used pamphlets, newspapers used headlines, medical journals used case reports, politicians used committees and public language that tried to sound calm while admitting fear. Laudanum had been ordinary for so long that outrage had to be taught. And outrage, once taught, does not stay focused. It spreads. It clings to whatever the culture already mistrusts. In Britain, organizations formed to protect children, to expose neglect, to shame the sellers of secret nostrums. Campaigners collected coroners' reports like ammunition. They spoke in public halls about infant deaths and quieting syrups. They demanded that something be done about medicines whose contents were hidden behind comforting names. In the United States, the patent medicine industry came under growing attack as well. The public started to see, in plain language, what had been sold to them as gentleness: alcohol, morphine, and other strong ingredients. Labeling became a moral issue, not just a commercial one, because when a label lies, the lie is not abstract. The lie is swallowed, and once swallowed, it can change a life. The forbidden dispensary has always found it revealing that reform movements rarely begin with chemistry. They begin with stories. A dead child, a ruined household, a respected citizen discovered with an accidental overdose. Public policy is often written in the ink of grief. But public grief is not always clean. It can be sincere and cruel at the same time. Mothers were shamed, even when they had been targeted by predatory marketing and crushed by exhaustion. Poor families were treated as reckless, even when they had fewer options for medical care and fewer resources to manage chronic illness. The same society that sold them quiet also condemned them for buying it. And then, layered over all of that, came another kind of fear, one that attached itself not to the bottle alone, but to certain faces, certain neighborhoods, certain accents. When a drug becomes a public anxiety, it is often used as a tool for social sorting. Victorian and early modern drug panic did not exist in a vacuum. It tangled with empire, migration, and the long habit of blaming outsiders for what a society does to itself. In port cities and immigrant districts, opium smoking became a symbol in newspapers and popular fiction. The opium den was not only a place, it was a story. Foreignness, danger, moral collapse. Sensation novels and cheap journalism used it as scenery for corruption. Meanwhile, laudanum remained in respectable homes, its use framed as medicine, not vice. This division was not about chemistry, it was about social permission. The same opiate effect could be treated as acceptable when taken by a middle-class widow for nerves, and treated as depravity when associated with an immigrant community. That double standard shaped policy, because policy is rarely immune to the prejudices of its era. So the early moves toward control, poison registers, sales restrictions, labeling demands, were driven by a mix of motives. Some were genuinely protective, some were moralistic, some were opportunistic, and some were plainly rooted in fear of the other. The result was a legal approach that often targeted visible vice more aggressively than invisible domestic dependence. Even when laws were meant to protect, they did not always protect evenly. Still, something real had shifted. The idea that powerful drugs should not be sold as harmless comfort. That shift required a new kind of public literacy. People had to learn that a bottle could soothe and harm at the same time. They had to learn that quiet was not always safety. They had to learn to suspect sweetness. In Britain, the tightening of pharmacy practice and poison control continued in uneven steps. Stronger oversight did not eliminate misuse, but it made certain transactions less casual. It pushed the sale of opiate preparations toward trained professionals, toward records, toward scrutiny. In the United States, federal regulation, once it arrived, reshaped the market dramatically. Labeling requirements forced truth into print. Registration requirements forced opiates into paperwork, and paperwork, as dull as it seems, is a kind of barrier. A barrier can reduce impulse purchase. It can also trap those already dependent. That is where reform becomes complicated. The forbidden dispensary does not tell fairy tales about regulation. Regulation can save lives. Regulation can also create new harm if it turns patients into criminals and leaves them without care. When a dependent person is cut off abruptly, they do not become virtuous by force. They become sick. They become desperate. They seek relief elsewhere. That elsewhere can be dangerous. This is how illicit markets thrive, not only from greed, but from unmet need. The early modern era began to show this pattern. When legal supply tightened, some people found ways around the law. Informal sellers appeared. Corrupt professionals appeared. Smuggling appeared. Counterfeit preparations appeared. And addiction, once pushed out of polite spaces, became easier to treat as a moral failure rather than a medical condition. The public could point at the new criminal addict and feel reassured that the problem had been contained, even while dependence continued in less visible forms. This is what a society often does when it cannot tolerate its own reflection. It moves the mirror. Meanwhile, medical debate continued. Some physicians argued fiercely against overuse, describing ruined digestion, flattened affect, diminished appetite, and the relentless spiral of tolerance. Others defended opiates as essential, especially for severe pain and terminal illness. They were not wrong. Opiates could be compassionate in a world with limited alternatives. But compassion without caution can become harm, and caution without compassion can become cruelty. The argument became and remains a balance. Here is what changed most profoundly in the shift toward modern policy. The bottle began to lose its moral innocence. Once a society accepts that a drug can create dependence, it can no longer pretend every dose is purely therapeutic. The act of taking the drug becomes morally loaded, and moral loading changes how people behave. People begin to hide more. People begin to lie to doctors. Doctors begin to distrust patients. Patients begin to fear doctors. This is the social aftertaste of drug panic, and it can last longer than any single law. In our own archives, you can see when the tone of notes changes. Early entries are practical, for cough, for sleep, for pain. Later entries begin to show caution, use sparingly, do not repeat too often, warned. Eventually, a new kind of phrase appears, almost bureaucratic in its coldness. Refused. A dispenser refusing a sale, a physician refusing a refill, a system deciding that risk outweighs comfort. Sometimes refusal was wise, sometimes it was dangerous, sometimes it was shaped by prejudice rather than by medical judgment. And in those refusals, you can feel the birth of the modern era's tension, the struggle to control harm without abandoning the suffering. In the next part, we will return to the bottle itself, its sensory presence, its daily rituals, and the way it became both symbol and habit. We will also step closer to the moment when laudanum, once the reigning household hush, began to fade into the background as other opiates and other systems took its place. For now, hold on to this. Reform is rarely pure. It is often a braid of protection, fear, and power. The laudanum story did not end because society became wiser all at once. It began to end because the consequences became too visible to ignore, and because the modern state, once embarrassed, decided to count what had previously been allowed to remain uncounted. Counting is not mercy, but sometimes it is the beginning of responsibility. There are objects that do not look like history until you hold them long enough. A cork, a stained label, a spoon with a slight bend where someone pressed too hard. In the forbidden dispensary, we keep such things not as trophies and not as curiosities, but as reminders that the past was lived in small motions. The grand arguments, empire, law, medicine, morality, were carried out in the ordinary act of reaching for relief. Laudanum's reign was never announced with trumpets, and its retreat was no grand farewell either. It did not vanish. It thinned. It receded into the corners as other forms of opiates took center stage and as regulation made the old casual purchase less simple. But even as it faded from the spotlight, it left behind a residue that shaped the modern world. Part of that residue was cultural, the way people came to think about pain. Victorian life trained people to endure, but it also trained them to seek private assistance for endurance. Laudanum became a rehearsal for a modern habit, the idea that suffering should be managed chemically so life can continue uninterrupted. Another residue was institutional, the way pharmacy and medicine learned to behave once a drug's risks became undeniable. Record-keeping, restricted sale, labeling, professional gatekeeping. These were not born solely from opium, but opium accelerated them. It forced systems to develop a vocabulary for dependence, and then to build rules around that vocabulary. And part of the residue was intimate, the way families learned to keep certain needs quiet. Because even when laudanum was no longer fashionable, the desire it served did not disappear. People still wanted sleep. People still wanted calm. People still wanted their grief to stop talking. The bottle's particular sensory world helped it linger in memory. If you have ever uncorked a spirit bottle in a dim room, you know the smell, sharp warmth, a sweetness that feels older than the moment, something that climbs the throat before you have tasted a drop. Laudanum carried that, braided with bitterness, a medicinal edge, a plant's dark echo. It did not taste pleasant, not really, but it did not need to. It promised effect, not flavor. And the effect was reliable enough that people forgave the taste. A spoonful could make a coughing fit soften. A spoonful could make a cramped belly unclench. A spoonful could make an anxious mind stop pacing. So the ritual became part of domestic life. A bottle in a drawer, a spoon beside it, The cork returned carefully so the scent did not travel. In some homes, it was treated almost reverently, a medicine to be used sparingly in true need. In others, it was as casual as tea, used for every ache because the century offered too many aches and too few remedies. This is where Laudanum's story turns into a mirror for every era that follows. The line between careful use and habitual use is not drawn in ink. It is drawn in routine, and routine can change without announcing itself. A person might begin with only at night, then only on difficult nights, then only when I cannot cope. And then one day, the body decides coping is impossible without it. The tragedy is not only dependence. The tragedy is how easy it is for dependence to feel like practicality while it is forming. By the time modern controls grew firmer, truthful labeling, restricted access, more formal pharmacy oversight, many people had already learned to think of opiates as the default answer to certain kinds of suffering. So the state did what states often do. It acted late and then acted hard. The bottle that had once been a household object became, in the 20th century, part of a regulated category. Opiates became something tracked, prescribed, documented. In theory, this was safety. In practice, it was also a reshaping of who was allowed relief. Those with money, connections, and respectable presentation often found access easier. Those without status found suspicion quicker. Medical gatekeeping can prevent misuse. It can also enforce inequality. The old problem, pain, remained. The old remedy, opiates, remained. The new difference was the legal and moral framework wrapped around them. Laudanum, meanwhile, was becoming an old name. Modern pharmacies moved towards standardized products, tablets, measured syrups, injectable forms in hospitals. The tincture of opium remained in certain uses and settings, but it no longer carried the same cultural centrality. Yet the story did not end with the bottle's decline. It shifted into new forms. The modern world's opiate story is not laudanum repeated exactly. It is laudanum echoed. New molecules arrived with new claims of safety. New companies learned how to market relief in language that sounded responsible. New systems were built to track supply and yet struggled to keep pace with demand. New waves of dependence rose, often among people who began with legitimate pain and ended in a fight they never intended to join. That is why the laudanum century still matters. It taught the pattern early. A society creates pain. A market sells relief. A culture praises composure. A bottle offers quiet. A body learns the quiet. A state notices the harm and writes rules. The rules change supply, not need. And around it all, human beings do what they have always done, try to make the day livable. In the forbidden dispensary, we do not pretend we can solve the past, but we can tell the truth about it without dressing it up. So let us speak plainly about what laudanum revealed. First, pain is political. Industrial injuries, poverty, overwork, lack of medical care. These conditions made opiate use widespread because they made suffering widespread. Laudanum did not create those conditions. It lubricated them. It helped people endure what they should not have been asked to endure. Second, respectability can be dangerous. A culture that demands quiet will always find substances and rituals that manufacture quiet, and then it will praise those substances for keeping the peace. The price of that peace may be paid later, privately. Third, secrecy is profitable. Patent medicines thrived because they hid contents behind comforting language. The bottle that tells the truth sells less easily than the bottle that sells a feeling. Fourth, regulation is necessary and insufficient. It can reduce harm, but it can also push harm into darker corners if it is paired with punishment instead of care. The dependent person does not stop being dependent because a law wishes it. Laudanum's story is therefore not only a Victorian story. It is a human story about how relief is managed in societies that often refuse to slow down. In the next part, our final stretch, we will tie the threads together. The praise inside the name, the bottle on the table, the way a medicine became both comfort and cover, and the quiet irony that the most celebrated remedy of an era also helped that era avoid facing the deeper causes of its pain. For now, imagine the bottle one last time as it was so often seen. Small, amber, unremarkable, a private instrument for the public performance of composure. And remember, the most dangerous things are not always the ones that look like weapons. Sometimes they look like a spoon. There is a word hidden inside laudanum that most of its users never pause to taste. Praise. Not in the religious sense, not in the bright sense. A practical praise, the kind a tired person gives to anything that allows them to get through another day without falling apart in public. In the forbidden dispensary, we have watched praise reshape morality. What people praise, they excuse. What they excuse, they repeat. What they repeat, they hand down. That is how a tincture becomes tradition. The old stories like to begin with Paracelsus, and they should, because he matters, restless, abrasive, certain that medicine could be made from chemistry and not only from theory. He took opium and made it travel-ready. He made it fit in a pocket. He made it feel like a modern miracle in an old world. Then apothecaries did what apothecaries always do. They adapted. They adjusted. They argued with each other in quiet ways, in different recipes, in different strengths, in different spices. They made laudanum into a family rather than a single formula. Then physicians gave it legitimacy. Names like Sydenham attached themselves to the tincture, and with that attachment came authority. The bottle stepped from the back shelf into respectable practice. Then the 19th century arrived and provided the perfect conditions for laudanum to thrive. Industrial injury, crowded housing, chronic cough, relentless work hours, strict etiquette, limited alternatives for pain and sleeplessness. The bottle answered all of it in one gesture. Quiet, not cure, not repair, not justice. Quiet, and quiet has a particular seduction because it makes life seem orderly even when it is not. A worker could return to the loom with pain dulled. A mother could keep her face composed. A grieving household could carry on without making the neighbors uncomfortable. In that sense, laudanum did not merely treat symptoms. It served the social machine. It helped people perform endurance. This is why laudanum's history cannot be reduced to chemistry alone. It is a story of what an era demanded from bodies and hearts. The Victorian period, for all its moral language, was harsh in its expectations. It praised labor, it praised restraint, it praised the appearance of calm, but it did not always provide what would make calm honest. Safer workplaces, better public health, support for women, protection for children, treatment for despair that did not rely on silence. So the bottle became a substitute for what society would not fix. That is the soft, dark irony inside the praise. Laudanum was celebrated because it allowed a society to go on without changing. It is easy to blame individuals in this story: a mother who overdosed, a worker who became dependent, an apothecary who compounded too strong a batch, a manufacturer who hid ingredients behind sweet labels. Some individuals deserve blame, especially those who knowingly profited from concealment. But the larger truth is structural. A substance that offers immediate relief will be used widely in a world that distributes suffering widely. And once used widely, it reshapes culture. It reshaped domestic practice by making chemical comfort normal. It reshaped medicine by forcing doctors to confront dependence. It reshaped law by pushing the state toward control and record-keeping. It reshaped literature by turning opium into symbol and obsession. Even death in those years was altered by the bottle. Because laudanum could make death look like sleep, it complicated the work of coroners and courts. It forced toxicology to grow teeth. It made households fear their own cupboards. And at the same time, the empire moved opium like any other commodity. Fields far from London fed the medicine chest in London. Trade routes and colonial administration made abundance possible. Commerce made marketing ruthless. Industrial printing and rail distribution made the bottle ubiquitous. So by the time regulation began to tighten, poison registers, pharmacy control, labeling laws, taxes and registration, laudanum's work had already been done at scale. The society had already learned the habit, and habits once learned do not disappear neatly. They adapt. They move from laudanum to morphine, from spoon to syringe, from domestic bottle to standardized tablet, from open purchase to controlled prescription, from respectable hush to stigmatized dependence. The 20th century did not end the opiate story. It reorganized it. It built systems meant to limit harm, and those systems sometimes saved lives and sometimes created new shadows. If there is a moral here, it is not a sermon about weakness. It is a warning about incentives. When a culture demands productivity at any cost, it will reach for substances that make bodies comply. When a culture prizes composure above honesty, it will reach for substances that make grief quiet. When a market is allowed to hide danger behind tenderness, it will. And when the state responds only after harm becomes visible, it will always be late. We say this not to condemn the past from a clean distance, but because the pattern repeats. Different labels, different molecules, different paperwork. Same human need, same temptation to believe that a bottle can solve what society refuses to face. In the next and final part, we will close the cabinet gently. We will leave you with the last image, the amber glass beside the teacup, and the question the laudanum century leaves behind. What does it mean when a society praises a drug not because it heals, but because it helps people endure what should never have been normal? For now, let the word praise sit with you, not as blessing, as evidence. So here we are at the last cabinet door. In the forbidden dispensary, we close things the same way we open them, slowly, without sudden noise. Some stories deserve that, not because they are fragile, but because they are heavy, and you can bruise yourself if you drop them. Laudanum was never only a drug, it was an agreement. An agreement between a suffering body and a world that refused to slow down. An agreement between grief and decorum. An agreement between commerce and concealment. An agreement between the private need for relief and the public need for people to remain useful. It promised quiet, and in an era that demanded quiet, it was praised. That praise is the thread that runs through the whole history, from the earliest tinctures to the Victorian cupboard. It begins with the old alchemical impulse: take the dark sap of the poppy and make it portable, make it measurable, make it a remedy that can travel. Then it passes through the hands of apothecaries who made laudanum into a family rather than a single formula. Their counters smelled of spirit and spice. Their bottles were sealed with wax and reassurance. Their work sat at the strange border between help and hazard. Then it passes through physicians who gave it the stamp of respectable medicine while knowing, sometimes too late, that the same remedy that stilled pain could also teach the body to demand more. Then it reaches the 19th century, where its role becomes almost inevitable. Industry grinds bodies down, cities choke lungs. Households strain under expectation. Women are told to be calm, mothers are told to be quiet. Men are told to work through injury as if injury were a moral test. In that world, laudanum was not an exotic indulgence. It was a tool of survival. And then, as survival tools often do, it turned. It turned into habit. It turned into secrecy. It turned into marketable sweetness. It turned into tragedy in nurseries and into suspicion in courtrooms. It turned into a problem that no one could keep calling private. The state, as states tend to do, arrived late with lists and forms, pharmacy registers, poison schedules, labeling requirements, taxes and tracking. The bottle was pushed behind counters. The spoon was replaced in many places by standardized tablets and clinical syringes. The old tincture receded. But the deeper lesson did not recede. Because laudanum did not create the pain of its century, it managed it, it softened it, it made it easier to ignore. That is why its history is so unsettling when told honestly. It forces a question that the Victorians rarely asked out loud. If a medicine becomes necessary for ordinary life, what does that say about the life? If people require a chemical hush to endure work, what does that say about work? If women require sedation to remain presentable, what does that say about the demands placed on them? If infants are quieted with narcotics so a household can function, what does that say about the support that household lacks? The bottle can be blamed, and sometimes should be. But the bottle was also an answer to conditions that were never truly addressed. Laudanum was praised because it allowed people to keep going. It allowed a society to continue without repairing itself. This is the final irony, soft and dark. The remedy praised for solace also became a mechanism for postponing change. In our back room, we keep one old amber bottle that has no label. It could have belonged to anyone. It could have sat beside anyone's bed. It could have been held by a midwife on a winter night, by a dock worker before dawn, by a widow staring at a wall. It is empty now, but it still carries a faint scent if you lift it close. Spirit and bitterness, memory and residue. That empty bottle is the best symbol we have for the laudanum century, because it is both ordinary and consequential. It is both comfort and warning. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Laudanum was praised because it worked, and it was dangerous for the same reason. Relief is not a sin. Wanting relief is not weakness. But when relief becomes the substitute for justice, when comfort becomes a replacement for care, when quiet becomes more valued than well-being, a society will keep praising the bottle until the costs become impossible to hide. The Victorians learned that late, in courtrooms and in inquests, in medical journals and reform campaigns, in the slow shift from household remedy to regulated drug. We inherit their lesson whether we want it or not. So we close the cabinet. Not with a slam, not with condemnation, with clarity. The amber glass beside the teacup was never just decoration. It was a private instrument for the public performance of composure. And that performance, once you recognize it, is not confined to the past.